Welcome to another episode of the Spinoza Triad Philosophy Podcast, where myself, John Gibbs, Dr. Richard Miller and Dan Rowland discuss philosophy and try to make sense of philosophical ideas for no other reason than we find this stuff quite fun and interesting, and also to force us to read things. This week, unfortunately Dan couldn't join us. Richard and I have been reading Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher of the 19th century, and particularly his book Either Or. This is what we made of it.
Is your camera turned on, John?
Yeah, I've got the little light next to my camera. I clearly because I can see me as well. So sound thing showing. So
never mind. It's probably the Chinese. Infiltrating.
This is in somewhere in Beijing right now. This has popped up on a screen.
Yeah. Here they go. They're at it again.
They're scouring this data, and they're not sure what to do with it. But
don't stick it in a bin.
They listen to this, and they're now convinced that Western civilization is over. Anyway, so
we're
Kierkegaard.
Where should we start then?
Let's start. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we set ourselves a task, didn't we, to read Kierkegaard and find out more about him and so on. It's been a fascinating discovery. I've liked it, even though it's a fairly austere kind of message. I think, I'm just. I think it's that's it. That was the end of that thought. Actually, it's an austere. It's a somewhat austere message. It's a hard challenge he lays down.
He's not a thinker with a set of this is Kierkegaard thinks, and you can sort of bullet point out his arguments. They're largely within the way in which it's written in the pseudonyms that he uses, especially in Either Or. Anyway, had you heard of him? I mean, it's not you heard of him. Had you had any kind of interactions with his stuff before?
No, not at all. So my knowledge of Kierkegaard was Kierkegaard, the inspiration for existentialism. So I thought, okay, I think I know a bit about existentialism, but he must say stuff like that. And that was it. And then I started reading a bit.
And what did you think? What are your sort of takeaway thoughts of that?
Well, so I plunged into Either Or, which I think was his. We were saying before we started recording, when I say his successful books, I don't think he was widely read in his lifetime, but it is. This book is notorious because it's got a section in it called The Seducer's Diary, which is scandalous. So lots of people are talking about it. He publishes this book, and it's his. Then he becomes noticed, as it were. And as you say, he writes in all of his books. I don't think he writes in his own name at all. I think all of the books are authored by imaginary characters he's created with sometimes quite absurd sort of names, in order that you're not fooled into thinking this is. I wonder if this is written by Kierkegaard. No, so clearly it is written by Kierkegaard, but he's going to write in the voice of somebody else. So the first thing you think, well, what do you actually believe? It's almost like he's presenting the reader with some kind of thought experiment. So try this, think this. See?
The more you sort of delve into him, I mean, he's a Christian, isn't he? He has a very, I'd say, a sort of critical Christian perspective, doesn't he? He has a faith, but he was very critical of the way in which the church were run at the time, wasn't he? He mentions about sort of lifestyle Christianity as opposed to what he deems as actual faith, which again, for him, faith being something that hinged around doubt, he argues that the concept of faith is really a couplet of belief and doubt together. So those two things together will give you faith. And the idea, I mean, he's famous for, isn't he, the leap of faith. I wonder if it's worth here, John, just going over the kind of backbone of Either Or.
Okay, yeah. So it's his first big successful book. It's two books written by ostensibly two authors. The first one, and then there's an introduction which explains that the manuscript of this book was found in an old bit of furniture, and he opens it and he discovered this manuscript. These are the letters and writings. Some of them are just a list of aphorisms, but the bulk of the first part of the book is written by an author called A, That's all he is A. And he is an aesthete. And he's going to describe the aesthetic life. And he's going to describe his friend, who's a seducer, and the pursuit of beauty. So it's either or. And the or is the second part of the book by Judge William, who's writing letters to A to try and dissuade him from this, presumably somewhat what he sees as dissolute life, and instead embrace a life which has purpose. His principal objection to the aesthetic life is that it's purposeless.
Did you not think that? I mean, it's quite, on the one hand, quite easy to look at this and think it's quite derogatory towards you. Well, you assume, don't you, that we're going to get here a very negative view of the aesthetic life, and then really one good for the ethical. But the way in which he describes the aesthetic life, and it's a theme that goes through quite a lot of this stuff, is it's not necessarily. It ends up negative in terms of it. He talks about anxiety and despair, doesn't he? Forms of despair, but it's not just a sort of hedonistic kind of. I don't know. Like I think in sort of a contemporary culture would say, someone is a hedonistic, drink, drugs, parties, and this kind of thing. Because he talks about the artist and the musician and these kinds of quite, I guess, on the one hand, quite honourable pursuits that he considers to be. Yeah. That really will never lead you out. He talks about, doesn't he, a cellar in a house. You can never leave the cellar while you're pursuing the aesthetic existence. I didn't necessarily feel that you need the ethical as strongly, perhaps, as he does.
No, absolutely. And there's a sort of 19th century movement, the aesthetic movement. I mean, people like Oscar Wilde, who are, beautiful young men who are bored by life. And what is it? Oscar Wilde says something like, the art of life is to be astonishing, but be astonished by nothing. So you affect boredness. You're bored by life, but you live a life dedicated to beauty. Not, as you say, not wine, women, and the song necessarily. I mean, though there is a seducer in the first part, it's the pursuit of the gorgeous. It's a bit like that late 19th century romanticism, which clearly Kierkegaard is not attracted by. The idea of the mystery within the beauty, the arts and craft houses, the William Morris houses. Things must be perfect. Things must be crafted. Enjoying the moment. Well, actually, that's a very attractive sort of philosophy of life. Really, it's not a million miles away from Epicurus. That kind of living in the moment. There's beauty in ordinariness.
That aspect of the aesthetic life is the pursuit of pleasure. Where that leads him, though, is to the anxiety caused by choice, doesn't it? This is where it starts to become a problem, because on the one hand, this idea of embracing the arts, embracing, I guess, almost like creativity, isn't it, in some respects? But the aesthetic existence was that you become then plagued by choice, and there's a fantastic. If you marry, you will regret it. If you do not marry, you will regret it. If you marry and do not marry, that the bit there.
Yeah. You're doomed to disappointment and a kind of bored, underwhelming feeling.
The issue
about life.
there is as much with the actual aspect of choice itself. The aspect of choice itself, I think that's one of the things that he's trying to get at there, isn't it? That if you have too much choice, you end up almost crippled by it. It's a bit like what's his name, Tim Ferriss. Have you ever listened to his stuff? He did 4-Hour Work Week and 4-Hour Body, a few things. Really interesting guy, has a podcast and stuff he does. I remember listening to a podcast with him where he was, I don't know if he got a dog. He was talking about getting a dog because it limited, I mean, other than the fact, obviously, he probably wanted a dog as well. I like to think it's not the only reason he got one, but it was for the idea of choice, that it limited the amount of choice he had for a given day, because too much choice is not necessarily a good thing. You end up doing nothing because you can't make your mind up over any one thing, and it's been explored, isn't it, by psychology and philosophy over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. That idea that choice induces anxiety. I remember showing students that TED talk by a chap called Barry Schwartz, who'd written a book called The Paradox of Choice, in which he described how there were literally hundreds of kinds of salad dressing available in a modern supermarket compared to dozens of 30, 40, 50 years ago. So in a lifetime, although it seems quite banal sort of observation. It's simply a reflection of the enormity of choice and the amount of time people spend making choices and having a sense thereby of what they didn't choose. For every choice, there's a sense of the thing that you didn't bring home. I wish I'd got the other one. By our anxiety, should I return it? I mean, people like the chap you mentioned, Tim Ferriss, recommend things like buy things that can't be returned. The art of making bad choices and putting up with it. That's difficult for us to relearn that idea, except the products you didn't, that don't live up to the advertising, because things don't live up to the advertising. People like Naomi Klein in No Logo. Another thing we used to explore with students was this idea that consumerism produces anxiety because the anxiety itself has to be satisfied by consuming. It's not an accident that advertising has an inverse relationship. There's a study by Warwick University, a chap called Andrew Oswald, who carried out this, an inverse relationship between advertising spending in societies and societies with low advertising spending and higher levels of anxiety. In other words, advertising appears, whether there is there may be a direct correlation, there might not be a causation, but nonetheless, advertising causes anxiety. I don't think that's a particularly original idea, and I think it's one we certainly have lived with. From Oliver James in Affluenza, the idea of that prosperity comes alongside a certain degree of anxiety, and anxiety produces the image, the production of images of the life you're not living. You could almost describe that as the definition of what advertising is, and our society has become enormously good at producing examples of the people you're not living, the so-called influencers, these young, beautiful people who talk to you through filters about their perfect lives. I mean, talk about anxiety-inducing. My goodness. There was, however, another study I remember talking to students about the old people's home, where they had the old retirement community, where they monitored the death rates. Well, hopefully they were monitoring the death rates, and the number of people who died per year or month, year hopefully. And the death rates in the old folks' home, all the people in their deep old age, so there would be a certain amount of regularity to people dying. And they introduced into the old folks' home more choice. Instead of having a set menu, Monday it was fish and Tuesday it was meat pie, they introduced a choice on the menu, a little more choice of activities, and death rates declined. Now, the startling revelation there appears to be that no choice at all, absolute lack of agency in your life, is also highly corrosive to your sense of identity. Marry, and you will regret it. Don't marry. You will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you will regret it either way. Laugh at the world's foolishness. You will regret it. Weep over it. You will regret that too. Laugh at the world's foolishness or weep over it. You will regret both. Believe a woman, you will regret it. Believe her not, you will also regret it. Hang yourself, you will regret it. Do not hang yourself, and you will regret that too. Hang yourself or don't hang yourself, you'll regret it either way. Whether you hang yourself or you do not hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the essence of all philosophy.
But it is one that's plagued by choice, isn't it, for him?
Yes.
And that, I think that's where he starts to, because he got I bought the book actually, it's one on anxiety. I think he just called it Principles of Anxiety. But it's something that I think definitely, he's often named as the sort of father of existentialism. But I think that it's the concept of anxiety caused through choice and subjectivity, you are wallowing in choice. If you go on a sort of social media, I don't know, an Instagram or something, and you look at you can just literally thumb your way through choice. It's just one image after another image after another image, and no one thing takes your interest. You are almost training yourself for a form of ADHD, aren't you, where you can't concentrate on any one thing because you're so used to this ever moving kind of just constant shifting of images and choice. And I think as well as that, I mean, I think one of the other podcasts we talked about the hedonic treadmill. That really, as part of that as well, I think this kind of links in with this aesthetic existence. That in the end, anything that you pursue for pleasure or for beauty, whatever it may be, you end up very quickly acclimatized to it. So this idea of a hedonic, hedonistic treadmill, where it's just you get used to it, and then it just keeps moving and moving and moving, and you need sort of more and more of it to get some form of satisfaction. But that split up within this with Kierkegaard with this idea of I suppose it's kind of a radical choice, isn't it?
Again, it's very modern. That idea of the hedonic treadmill, it's a very Frankfurt School. So in the mid 20th century, it's more than a century after Kierkegaard's death, people like Marcuse and so on are going to describe the consumer pursuit, the euphoria of unhappiness. And you can see euphoric unhappiness around us all the time. I think we've talked about this before, but it's sort of desperate scrambling and knowing that you fail because it's falling between your fingers. The material stuff you get is all going to end up on a tip. Everything you do is crumbling away, and you can sense it. I think that is the sense of the failure of the pursuit of beauty. Beauty is transitory.
But I think that's kind of one of the arguments that Kierkegaard's getting at here, which launches him into the ethical. Because the ethical for him is almost a bit like a kind of Kantian fidelity to one's duty. It seems to be the idea that you should then start to live your life in a way that's dutiful for other people.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem with the pursuit of beauty. Is that you end up using, as Judge William points out to me, you end up other people just become means. They are like you said. I hope the guy didn't buy the dog just simply as a form of kind of distraction or life limit or something. As a tool. And in that respect, the pursuit of beauty through other people, they become simply tools, or objects become means by which you distract yourself. They aren't. There's no purpose to it other than your own selfishness. Ultimately, the pursuit of beauty, the bored young man who spends his morning at the tailor and his afternoon at the club, and is bored by everything he sees, is in essence selfish. Because while it's very beautiful and very attractive, very witty, he is also purposeless, just idly moving through life, using those around them. Clearly the aesthete is going to suggest that since we live in a meaningless universe, what is the truth? Other than beauty. Beauty is truth. Truth is beauty. That is the only pursuit that's worthwhile. Since all your morality and categorical imperatives and such like, just so much structure, so much overlaying of the only real thing you can possibly appreciate, which in your brief span is some kind of attempt to find beauty. It's quite an attractive idea. Yeah, it's a terrible responsibility to bear, to place yourself at the centre of the world, and to pursue through choices that pursue beauty in your life. It's a burden. I mean, I was thinking of the film actually, American Beauty, and in American Beauty, there's the first part of the film, Kevin Spacey character and his so on. You find out that he's dead, and then they portray a family, sort of suburban family, where they're all desperately miserable. The daughter hates the father, finds him contemptible, and that the wife and their marriage appears to be one of mutual loathing, and they find no happiness in this accrued collection of material things,
Yeah.
or the pursuit of a career, or the pursuit of objects. I've left him bereft of any kind of happiness. But the young man that the girl, his daughter, meets a young man who videos a bag being blown around in the breeze and says, in that there is beauty. There's beauty in the ordinary, a piece of garbage floating
that's a great
on
quote,
a breeze. That's very sort of Kierkegaardian, isn't it? That idea of the finding the beauty in the moment, or at least it's very Kierkegaardian's idea of what the aesthetic life might be.
The whole secret lies in arbitrariness. People think it requires no skill to be arbitrary, yet it requires deep study to succeed in being arbitrary without losing oneself in it, to derive satisfaction from it oneself. One's enjoyment is not immediate, but is something quite different which one arbitrarily ejects. You see the middle of a play. You read the third part of a book. In this way, one derives a quite different enjoyment from one the author has been so good as to intend for you. One enjoys something entirely accidental. One regards the whole of existence from this standpoint, lets its reality run aground on it. I will give an example. There is someone whose chatter certain circumstances made it necessary for me to listen to. He was ready at every opportunity with a little philosophical lecture which was utterly boring. Driven almost to despair, I discovered suddenly that he perspired unusually profusely when he spoke. I saw how the pearls of sweat gathered on his brow, then joined in a stream, slid down his nose, and ended hanging in a drop at the extreme tip of it. From that moment, everything was changed. I could even take pleasure in inciting him to begin his philosophical instruction, just to observe the sweat on his brow and on his nose.
Definitely, there's also kind of the idea of modern life being banal, isn't it? There's a nothingness to it, and I wonder if that's quite Kierkegaardian as well.
That is very Kierkegaardian, isn't it? I mean, that's why. I mean, that's we got onto existentialism. Is the that got to do that one with the clown. He says life is like a theatre. The clown comes out on stage and tells the audience that the theatre is on fire. They think it's part of the act and start laughing. No, he urges even more urgently. The theatre really is on fire. They laugh even more, thinking it's part of the act. And then he ends up, there's a sort of pause. He says, that's how the world's going to end. That's good, it's sort of stupidity and blunderous nonsense. Much of living any kind of human life, I reckon, is to be deeply disappointed by your fellow man.
Yeah.
in all its shapes and forms.
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, either one or the other, isn't it? Amazed at how much better or how good people are at certain things, or just utterly disappointed.
Well, yeah. I mean, as we, I remember the sort of back in the 80s when oh God, the world's going to blow themselves up, the Cold War, and the mountains and mountains of nuclear weapons, and the marches through London. I remember joining CND and thinking, oh, we've got to save the world. Then the Cold War ended, and you think, well, okay, the human beings have come through this great test, and yet now where are we? Unbelievable stupidity. Back to the 19th century. Anyone from the 19th century, Kierkegaard, are around right now. And he said, well, actually, there's a major war going on with Russia and the West. Well, they're saying that's what was happening when I was around. The great game, the empires of the world are at each other's throats again. Stupidity prevails everywhere.
I opened my eyes and saw reality and started to laugh, and I haven't stopped since. A fire broke out backstage in a theatre. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world will come to an end. To general applause from wits who believe it's a joke.
All of the, we've looked at Schopenhauer a little while ago, we looked at Nietzsche and so on. These people, in the mid to late 19th century, and Hegel. But we should have mentioned, by the way, that Kierkegaard does not like Hegel. He really, and to some extent, along with Nietzsche and along with Schopenhauer, they're reacting to Hegel. And the reason they're reacting to Hegel is Hegel, as you say, has a sort of totalizing model of how the world works. It's being driven by an intelligence, a sort of spirit behind history, behind society, behind the world, the Geist, and it makes sense. There is purpose because humanity's journey through time is purposeful. Well, he rejects all that. Ultimately, for Kierkegaard, although he never saw it, of course, the play Waiting for Godot is a perfect example of the way he might view the world. Some men show up. Mr. Godot's going to come. He doesn't ever come during the play. They talk. They wait. They wonder about life. A young man, a slave called Lucky, only has one speech, but it's a sort of 5-minute rant of nonsense. Well, 5-minute rant of nonsense, you could almost just say that's the internet, isn't it? The sort of ranting nonsense in a world of void and purposelessness where nothing happens, people are bored, and the play ends with Mr. Godot not showing up, just as he didn't show up at the beginning, and you're not certain he really exists. And that's absolutely anti-Hegelian, isn't it? There's no purpose to anything. It's just a drift through.
Yeah, do you know what though, John? I guess he's rejecting of Hegel, but he does also have concepts of the self. The anxiety is kind of hardwired into the human subject because it's self-relating. And that's a kind of Hegelian idea, kind of self-certainty that Hegel talks about, where you come in, consciousness comes about when you recognise yourself as a self, and sort of that self-relating is something that he takes on board. But what he does with it is he says he talks about there being this self-relating to different aspects, but until you make that subjective leap of faith, if you like, to your relationship with God, you will always have. It's necessary that you will always be anxious or have this element of doubt and anxiety, I suppose.
And you could say that the purposeless, drift through is the modern condition. It's the post-Hegelian modern condition. It's the death of God, the failure of science and materialism to satisfy what the comforts of primitive religion might have done. It's the end of the meta-narratives the postmodernists are going to go on about, the end of the belief in progress, the end of the belief in the certainties of science, the end of the belief that somehow things will work out. No one's coming. No one's going to answer the call. No one's listening to the prayers. It's a shout in the darkness. Yeah. And that's going to be repeated constantly through literature of all kinds and films of all kinds in the 20th century and the late 19th century, novels and so on, from Dostoevsky onwards, challenging and asking, what do you then do about this in this post-Hegelian world?
But we're missing a bit out there, John, because he goes, especially in Either Or, he's not in religious realm yet. He's got that step between that, which is the ethical, which is helping others, the married life, children, doing things for other people. He has a suspension. He calls it the suspension of the ethical, where he moves from that into the religious. I felt it had I mentioned Kant earlier. I don't want to sound like this. Just as Kant, I don't drop Kant in the conversation. It's not exactly like.
Oh, I do all the time. Yeah, If I can, I just say, "Oh, Kant, cup of tea, John." Yeah, Kant would like a cup of tea. He would.
But that kind of Kant's kind of ethics, isn't it? It's one of duty, And I got the kind of the feeling with the ethical for Kierkegaard. It's really, to move beyond this kind of anxious state of continual choice. There is an ethical stage there where in the ethical section, he's making the claim more about married existence, doing things for other people as opposed to thinking about yourself.
Yeah. It's the choice you make. Well, it's that choice that we've made when you have children and you realise that you have committed yourself to the biggest task in life that you'll ever take on, and it's a lifetime of commitment. You could see it as very very unselfish, very dedicated to a future you won't behold. The children that you'll bring up will live beyond you, and in a world that you can only sort of pass on to them. So it is a very ethical thing to have children.
And so and then from there, and I felt like a lot of the other books that he's got as well, kind of start going there towards. Chuck out the bulldog because I can hear him snoring. It's putting me off. Could you hear that through the recording? Anyone hearing that? That's Rhino the bulldog pushing up Zeds, which he does quite loud. It's just like I could just, he was getting louder and louder, and it doesn't get quieter the deeper he sleeps. And what I enjoyed with Kierkegaard is the idea of living by your passions, creativity, the arts, this kind of aesthetic mode. Then you've got the ethical, where you suspend those things in order for an ethical life in service of others or duty, and then the suspension of the ethical, I think he calls it, which is to introduce the religious form of life, which is a form of subjective faith. And the best example of that would be, in Fear and Trembling, he has Abraham, who's obviously going to sacrifice his son, and I'm sure everyone's aware of the story. He doesn't end up sacrificing him, and God says to him, "You've shown great faith." And so, Kierkegaard uses that, and I think what he's trying to get at is the enormity of faith and the subjective nature of it as well. Because for Kierkegaard, he doesn't reject objective truth in any sense, but he's kind of more interested in. He doesn't mean subjectivity in a sort of postmodern plural sense. I think what he's trying to talk about here is subjective, purely as you experience it. So faith is something which you experience as in a subjective nature with God, and it's a choice that you have to make. And like you say before, it's not necessarily comforting.
Embracing the unknown and finding no particular consolation in it, you'll be miserable until you die, and then death will cure you of that. But so there isn't a hope of delight in finding God. I think, in fact, if Kierkegaard fell into conversation with a sort of born again Christian who said, "Well, I was 30 years old and I gave up drinking and so on, and I found God," he'd say, "Well, you haven't found God. You've just used God. You've made up a God. It's how you, for your own purposes. Finding God's way beyond that. You've got to live your life in the pursuit of a faith that will leave you continually in troubled, anxious state. And the anxiety is good. That anxiety is life. The angst isn't something you should attempt to get rid of."
I think though, I think though that he has kind of, for him, the anxiety is in some respect anxiety in so far as the enormity of God, Fear and Trembling. That's the name of the book, isn't it? But the anxiety insofar as the curse of choice, which he maps out in the beginning of the aesthetic life. I think that's alleviated through faith. I think that's his point. Through a religious life, more than the ethical life, you might experience an anxiety in, say, the enormity of God or the concept of God, but the choice dimension. So he writes quite a lot about different forms of doubt. I think it was in Sickness and to Death, different forms of despair. The inauthentic and the authentic in despair, and the finite and the infinite exist in awareness of self. Again, it's going back to that idea of a self-relating awareness of the eternal self.
That one is in despair is not a rarity. No, it is rare, very rare, that one is not in despair. The common view, which assumes that everyone who does not think or feel is in despair is not, or that only he who says he is in despair is totally false. Yeah, I think with the inauthentic and the authentic despair, you have that kind of despair which for Kierkegaard is something you're aware of, and that kind of despair you're not aware of. I mean, if you can not be aware of despair, in other words, it manifests itself in maybe in angst or depression or feelings of incompleteness, but is masked by the modern world, the chasing around after material goods. So the inauthentic despairer is someone who doesn't know they're despairing and yet is despairing. In their desperation, their hunger. But it's Lucretius, the man who comes in and out of doors and chases around to his farm and all the time arrives, as soon as he arrives, wants to go somewhere else. This is very, very old, the kind of idea, and very common to us, I think, the idea of the despair that is hidden. You know, the laughing, smiling despair, and masked by a desperation in which you all appear to be having a good time, but why are the people at the party crying? And then I suppose there's the authentic despair, the embracing of despair, the thorn in the shoe that won't let you forget death and limited time and the inevitable meaninglessness and absurdity of life, which spurs you, as it were, on to seeking some kind of goal, some kind of greater good, some kind of creative energy. Almost immediately after the ministry of Jesus, all the theologians get hold of it and make it into something else. You know, they invent and they construct things that are inexplicable, things that cannot be understood. So if you are Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God is a waste of time. That's just sophistry.
And I think it is faith based in doubt, where someone's making the sort of subjective choice to embrace a relationship with God, not knowing, if you like, to take that leap of faith and accepting that, as opposed to perhaps one that's more sort of steeped in certainty. That's the religious existentialism. In fact, I can see my dog's Ria's chewing Groot's collar in the garden, which is he's not supposed to be doing, it was spoiling my flow.
And that brings to an end another episode of the Spinoza Triad. You've been listening to me, John Gibbs, and Dr. Richard Miller, as we discussed some of the works of Soren Kierkegaard, with a particular reference to either or. If you enjoyed our discussion, or you have comments, or you wish to follow updates on our progress as we fail to meet, and sometimes do meet, and the reading we're planning, join the Facebook group, the Spinoza Triad, or visit the website, also called the Spinoza Triad. Thank you for listening. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favoured and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything, to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked, and waited for the light, and went without the meat, and cursed the bread. Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home, and put a bullet through his head. Richard Cory by Edwin Arlington Robinson. And the music by Dr. Richard Miller.